talking with Rochelle Constantine, a marine biologist from the University of Auckland. What is a marine biologist?
Mostly we're interested about things that live in the ocean, but we're also really interested in land and oceanographic processes and weather processes and sediment and all kinds of things, because the ocean's 70% of our planet. So today I'm going to tell you about humpback whales and migration and some kind of cool work we've been doing recently understanding the Oceania humpback whales. Humpback whales, which are about 16, 17 metre long whale, were hunted heavily in Antarctica. What they did is they just killed so many whales. They killed over 200,000 humpback whales sort of in our, in the southern ocean, southern hemisphere region, which just gutted the population, so much so that all humpback whales in the world became endangered. Now the humpback whales throughout the world have recovered. Whales here in East Australia that are migrating up and down this coast, they're about 100% recovered these days, little there or thereabouts, whereas Oceania are just a little over 50% recovered. Even though they were exploited the same amounts down in Antarctica, why have the East Australians done so well when the Oceania whales aren't doing as well? So we knew a lot about the tropics. We felt that perhaps the answer lay down here in Antarctica. So we wanted to know what the whales were doing here. We went in 2010 on a joint Australian-New Zealand voyage, the Antarctic Whale Expedition, and we travelled out of Wellington and we covered from about here across to about here. These are the Balaini Islands. We found most humpbacks around the Balaini Islands area. Then when we used genetic signatures, we found that most of them matched to Australia. There was one match to New Zealand and there was one match to New Caledonia. And I was really disappointed because we wanted to understand the importance of the feeding grounds to the Oceania whales, because we thought, well, maybe this explains why they're not doing so well. Maybe they're feeding in an area where there's not as much prey. And then I found out that there were from the dock rangers at Raoul Island, because Raoul is actually part of New Zealand. It's about halfway between New Zealand and Tonga, part of the Kermadec group. The dock rangers there said, we get quite a lot of humpbacks passing by from about mid-September till around about mid-November. So in 2015, we took a vessel up there. We deployed 25 tags and we had 19 tags that actually worked all the way down to south of 60, which we'll just say is about here. And we got a huge surprise. Two things were a surprise. One, they came from all of these different places, about 1,600 kilometres, give or take, from each place to this little rock where they hung out for about 4 or 5 days, and then the tagged whales started heading south. So some of the whales, we had one come over here by East Cape, and then a mum with a calf, and then she travelled down here in this sort of area through here, and we had a couple that went like this. So we had 4 whales do that, and then we had a bunch of whales go like this. There were these 2 really distinctive groups. All of the whales that went in this really definite southeasterly trajectory were quite different to these whales who went straight south. Now, one of the things to remember is these whales at this point have not been feeding for about 7 months. So they're really hungry. They don't just go in a straight line down. Initially we thought, well, not we, but historically it was like they just go fastest point to get to food, right? They don't do that. Instead, they undertake these very different migration paths. All of these whales here were mothers with calves. So all of these whales who went straight down were mums with newborns of the year. All of these whales were adults, and that included females plus pregnant females. But no females with calves went here. We know probably some do, because there's always some. But it seems like there's this complete separation in migration path between these whales. And these whales here didn't move backwards and forwards across this space. And they spanned from this area to this area. So they're sort of this expanse of Oceania whales feeding grounds was about 4,100 kilometres. span of Antarctic waters that our Oceania whales fed in. And they came from a 3,600 kilometre span of breeding grounds through this tiny little rock. Then they funnel out to these really different feeding areas. What's really interesting is we now suspect that these females who were pregnant when we tagged them, in the next year they would have, headed up to whatever breeding ground they came from. If they had their calf, we suspect that maybe they come through Rao and then they would have come down here with their calf. So they go to completely separate breeding grounds based on their reproductive state at the time. Do they have a newborn or do they not have a newborn? And what's even more fascinating is looking back on the historical whaling data, it reflected this. They killed fewer females with calves here. I think it was like 0.3% compared to over here. They killed 2.1%. Were mothers with calves. This sort of distinction of females without calves this side and females with calves this side is a very clear and very historic one that the whales have been doing for a long time. The main take-home message for this, going back to my initial point, is why aren't the Oceania whales doing as well as the East Australians? Well, the East Australian whales feed in the Coral Sea region, but we know that the Australian whales, they swim down to this broader Baleines region and just south. Their hop between their feeding ground and their breeding ground, and their feeding ground is a matter of a few thousand kilometres. For these animals, their migration distance, for these ones, their migration distance in one direction from Rao to here was over 9,000 kilometres. And so return 18,000 in a straight line. For these, it was around about 5,000 kilometres. So return 10,000 plus the extra 2,000 on top. So these whales are swimming well in excess, perhaps up to 3 times as far as the Australian whales to get food. So there may be some energetic consequence of that, and maybe the Oceania whales don't have as many calves because they energetically perhaps not doing as well as the East Australian whales that are breeding faster. Also, we know that this Bellingshausen region is not as nutritionally good as the Baleine Islands region, so maybe that's another contributing factor. So we're looking into that now. We're interested for 2 reasons. One, they are the largest animals that have ever lived. They play a major role in Southern Ocean ecosystem functioning. We're learning that. Also, they're really important to many of the narratives of people throughout the world. So the people across the Pacific Islands, they hold them dear. For Māori and early Pacific voyagers, whales are they're a taonga. They were their ancestors that they travelled with. But there are also a lot of science reasons. We almost lost these whales. So I think there's a bit of guilt. I think there's understanding their role in the system, and also they're just fascinating creatures. So there's lots of layers as to why they're important to study.
And I suppose it also has a huge weighting in terms of which areas around Rao Island and Antarctica we want to protect for these whales.
Yeah, that's right. So one of the Ross Sea region marine protected area, which is now one of the largest in the world, one of the reasons why the Baleine Islands were included was because of our work on the humpback whales. And I think it is important to consider them. And it's also one of the major considerations with the Rangitahua Kermadec Sanctuary being considered. This is a really important place where whales gather and share all kinds of information. So, yeah.
And how can members of the public help in your research with whales?
In New Zealand, we have a really good network for sightings, reporting sightings. So there's 0800 DOC-HOT that you can call, or more importantly, it's probably easier to just go online onto the Department of Conservation, Marine Mammal Sightings, fill out their little sightings thing. There's a really good team now at DOC who are keeping note of all of those sightings. But if you're able to get a photo as well, that's what can help us. So there's this really cool site now, Happy Whale, and in there you literally just put your photo in. You don't have to do anything fancy, and it matches it to all the other photos that the public have put in. And you said you put some in, right?
Cool. Yeah.
So our photos go into Happy Whale just in case. So those whales at the Kermadecks, we put them into Happy Whale. So you never know, you might actually get a match to one of our whales. So that's a kind of really easy public use way that you can help us with our humpback work. Yeah, it's really cool.
That's awesome.
Yeah.
Thank you so much, Rochelle, for coming on Science on a Napkin. We really appreciate having you here.
Oh, you're welcome. Mā te wā.